I'm Robert with Knowmium, and welcome back to our hybrid live video series. This is video number 7. We're continuing our discussion about facilitating hybrid activities, and in this video we'll focus on planning activities, onboarding others when necessary, and holding discussions in live hybrid sessions. First, let's talk about planning. Any facilitator knows, no matter what format you're using, there usually is a lot of planning that goes into an interactive workshop. For hybrid, there's the technology needs, there's the specific activities we want to run, there's the instructions for those activities, and the backup plans we need in case technology or the activities themselves fail. It's a good time to review some of the things we've already talked about in this program. Planning in general takes more time for most hybrid sessions. In video number 2, we discussed if hybrid is even the right format for our next program, and one consideration is the amount of time it takes to simply plan it and to get all of the technology ready. We've also spent 2 videos talking about tech. We don't need to dive back into tech, but we always need to remember it is part of our overall planning process. And we've also heard a story about how complex instructions and delivering those instructions might be when we're working with different types of participants, face-to-face and virtual. Let's consider a moment some ideas from face-to-face facilitation. Most face-to-face facilitators know it's helpful to create or to have a facilitator's guide. If we're making our own program, especially for the first time, mapping out exactly what we're going to do in that session is a great idea. Not only does it help us organize our thoughts, it helps us if we're onboarding co-facilitators, but it really can act as notes in a live session that we can refer to make sure we're following our own methods and that we're staying on schedule. On the other side of the spectrum, there are a lot of face-to-face facilitators that don't need a facilitator's guide, at least not for every program. Maybe they've run a program many times and they've committed it to memory, and in other times, they know the activities they want to run and they don't need to go back to a guide. They simply have their PowerPoint slides ready to go, and they know pretty much how long each activity should take to keep them on schedule. There's also many cases where discussions bring up new activity ideas on the spot. For example, if I'm working with a small team face-to-face and I ask them about their goals and their challenges, there may be an activity that could fit them that I didn't bring into the session, but because I'm experienced, I could create that activity on the spot. Maybe it's simple discussion and role play, or maybe it uses some physical materials that are already in the room. Pen, paper, whiteboards, post-it notes, whatever you have. On the other side of this is virtual activities, and virtual facilitators know planning virtual activities is a lot harder to do on the spot. Whether or not we have a facilitator's guide, usually we need some advanced planning, especially with tech, to make virtual activities successful. Sure, I could throw people randomly into breakout rooms and tell them to role play or have discussions, but if I want them to interact using any apps, any surveys, any virtual whiteboards, I'm going to need to create some of those in advance, or the participants are simply going to be waiting for me to create them in the session. Now, of course, I could send them to an activity, create the next virtual components needed, and then when they come back, the next activity is ready to go. But most of this is better to do just in advance, especially if we want some time to have a breather and take a break as a facilitator. One of my favorite virtual facilitators is Cindy Huggett, and I love the research that she does. And every year, Cindy releases what is called the State of Virtual Training. In the 2022 report from Cindy, she found that most virtual facilitators, on average, are spending 12 and a half hours of planning and preparation for 1 hour of virtual interaction. That is a lot. If I have a 1-hour interactive workshop, from start to finish, I may need to spend 12 and a half hours or more planning it. Everything from talking to the client, to designing the facilitator's guide and activity instructions, to getting the technology, getting it ready, testing things out, onboarding a producer. There's a lot that goes into it. Now, for hybrid activities in a hybrid environment, take all the planning that you need for face-to-face, take all the planning that you need virtually, and combine them, and then add even more. As we've already heard, sets of instructions themselves can be very complex. Not only designing those instructions, but giving those instructions. So, once again, if you're thinking about getting into hybrid facilitation, make sure you're comfortable as a face-to-face facilitator and you're comfortable as a virtual facilitator. I highly recommend a facilitator's guide for hybrid workshops. Not only are they useful like they would be in a face-to-face or virtual environment, but it does help us when we're onboarding others. And if needed, we can jump to different parts of that facilitator's guide if things go wrong or we get behind schedule and we need to throw something out. And in a hybrid environment, getting behind schedule and throwing certain things out that aren't working is a very common occurrence. Facilitators Guide help us with the next part of this video, onboarding a producer or co-facilitator. I know we've already mentioned this a bit when we're talking about technology and onboarding people to the hardware and software that we're going to use. But remember, we need our co-facilitators and producers or any other assistants to be fully aware, not just of the tech that we're using, but the actual activities, the schedule, and sometimes even the instructions that we're going to be using. In a hybrid environment, there are many situations where I may need to go help other people, and that co-facilitator or producer could step in if they have my guide and they know how to use it. Now, of course, if I said to a producer that was not fully onboarded, can you please take 30 minutes of time and do something creative or interactive? If they're an experienced facilitator, they can probably keep the audience's attention and create some kind of on-the-spot activities, even if it's just using a quick blank whiteboard that doesn't take a lot of prep. But wouldn't it be better to have them take over our actual program so we don't get too far behind schedule in the case something has gone wrong? So once again, dress rehearsals are very important with your activities, with tech, and sometimes even with sample participants. Even just our friends or family could sit in their remote locations just to be our guinea pigs. Whether or not they're in the same room with us, we want to recreate and run the activities, or at least start running some of those activities to make sure everything is running smoothly. Now, for the rest of this video, let's discuss facilitating hybrid discussions. I know that the focus of this video series is going beyond discussions, but discussions are a huge part of interactive hybrid sessions. Even if you have a lot of role plays, a lot of simulations, a lot of apps and different tech that we're using, there are going to be times where we simply need to communicate about the questions we have and the results that we found in those activities. Our debriefs are usually discussions, and sometimes we do mix some technology in there. So no matter if you're having a meeting or you're debriefing activities, what are some things to consider for our hybrid communication? My first suggestion is create codes of communication. Some people like to call those codes of conduct. A facilitator could present some ground rules when they start a session. For example, virtual people, please be on camera, because our face-to-face people are also on camera and they can't simply turn it off. There could be other rules we want people to follow, like if you want to speak, please raise your physical hand or your virtual hand if you have some emojis. Instead of just giving these ground rules, I like to let participants create some of these, if not all of these, for themselves. This is especially useful if I'm going to be working with them in multiple workshops, or they're a long-term team that might use these codes of communication after my workshop is over. Allowing them to collaborate and say, this is something I hope the group would do, this is something that I hope the group would not do. These are great for long-term hybrid teams because they may say, please don't send emails before 6 a.m. or after midnight if we're working different schedules. But in our long-term meetings, knowing what we should or shouldn't be doing is very helpful. If our participants have created that for themselves, it's often easier for them to follow it and to have that internal motivation because they were part of that planning process. One part of my original definition about hybrid facilitation was that face-to-face and virtual participants are equal, at least as much as they could be. And a lot of that comes from the facilitator, treating them equally when we're giving instructions and having discussions, looking at certain face-to-face people, looking at certain virtual people. But we may need to put into our plans how we are going to treat people equally. For example, if I have 20 people in a hybrid program, 5 of them are face-to-face, but 15 of them are virtual, I may need to make a plan where I'm looking at the face-to-face people only about 25% of the time, because there's only 25% of the participants in the room with me. 75% of my time may be spent looking in the webcam or at the computer monitor to give more attention to the virtual participants simply because they create 75% of my overall participant list. We also need to consider who are we allowing to talk, and are there any prompts that we need when people have discussions? Sometimes face-to-face facilitators that are getting into hybrid workshops need to go virtual first. What I mean is the facilitator can say, I'm going to take the first question or the first statement from the virtual participants. If we get into this habit, it ensures that our virtual participants are active, and after we get some virtual ideas, we can then go to the face-to-face participants, which we're used to. On the other side of this, I have heard other facilitators say, over the last few years, since they've been doing virtual programs, they go virtual first automatically when they're running hybrid workshops, and sometimes the face-to-face participants feel a little bit left out. In that case, they may need to remind themselves, go face-to-face first, then revert to what seems more comfortable personally, going virtual. These are also great things to talk to the participants about. You can tell them, because only 25% of us are in the room with me, I'm only going to be spending 25% of my interactions with you, and that just creates the equality, and most people will understand and respect that. It also can help face-to-face participants interact with those virtual participants, asking them questions, listening to them, because, again, everyone's equal, ideally. Something that I've done before, in a virtual program, if I need to remember to look at or near my webcam, maybe I'll put some kind of sticker or note that says, look here. But in a hybrid environment, if my eyes are drawn to the computer monitor, I may need to put a sign on the back wall that says, don't forget us, or look at the face-to-face people, whatever we want it to say. Sure, the other participants are going to see that, but that's a great discussion topic to say, as a facilitator, I want to make sure I'm giving you as much or attention as possible, or equal attention as much as possible. Another thing we can do to prompt any participant, but especially face-to-face participants, is ask them to use the microphone. It's easy for face-to-face participants to forget the virtual people need to hear them too. Now, consider for a moment, if we don't have microphones around the room, sure, a face-to-face participant could come to the front and use a microphone that I have near the facilitator's area, or maybe there's one microphone in the participant's area and they need to go to it or pass it around. But if we have different microphones and different audio devices spread around the room, like on breakout tables, those face-to-face participants need to remember to come off of mute, speak, and go back on mute. This allows not only me to hear them, but the virtual participants can hear them, and it saves time because I don't have to repeat what they're saying into my microphone, and I don't have to ask them to repeat themselves, but do it off of mute. Another great tip for facilitating hybrid discussions is asking participants to use their name when they start speaking. Anytime they have something to say, they can say, "Robert here," and then add their input or their questions. There are many times in a hybrid setting where there's a camera pointed at the physical participants, but not everyone has their own camera. One camera in the room captures 10 physical participants. When they speak into a microphone, the virtual participants may not recognize who is speaking. They can't see whose lips are moving because the camera is too far away, or they just simply don't recognize their voice. This is also helpful when virtual participants are speaking, and maybe the virtual platform is not being broadcast in the physical room, at least not where the physical participants can see. Maybe it is, but the video boxes are really small and the physical participants in the back of the room can't quite make out those faces or names. Starting with your name is great. Of course, any facilitator knows if you have people's names, you can use those and get into that habit of calling people by name. That also creates a bit of rapport. As a facilitator in a hybrid environment, I sometimes take personal notes or make a checklist. There's two ways I've done this. First, I may have a list of participants. And when somebody speaks, whether they're face-to-face or virtual, I put a check mark next to their name. If I'm taking volunteers in the first hour of the session, I can see who has not spoken up, and then I can start calling on those people by name to speak up. I often prompt them that I'm going to do this. If I haven't heard from you in the first hour, I'm going to start calling on you in the second hour. Something else I like to do, especially if I have a big group or I don't have everybody's names, I'll simply put on a piece of paper a line. On the left, it says face-to-face. On the right, it says virtual. When I get an idea or a question from a face-to-face participant, I just put a check mark on that side of the paper. During the session, I can see if the virtual people are not speaking up, or maybe I haven't asked them to speak up enough. I can recognize that by the number of check marks and balance that with the number of virtual versus face-to-face participants that I have. In a physical face-to-face training session, we often use physical notes, sticky notes, whiteboards, flip charts. Sometimes we even have training decks with different activities. These are great as long as the virtual participants can also see them. You have technology, hopefully, that will allow this to happen. You could put your webcam facing a whiteboard or a wall that has sticky notes. If you're discussing specific sticky notes and the face-to-face participants are physically walking over to that wall, you could carry the webcam over there and show the different sticky notes to the virtual participants. Oftentimes, if I have documents or other training materials that are laying flat on a table, I might take a tripod extension and I can move the tripod so the camera is facing down at the table. I can move any document or any material underneath that webcam. Of course, I have to remember, can the face-to-face people see it? But usually there are solutions for that. Now, of course, some of you are thinking, why would I use a physical whiteboard if I have virtual whiteboards available and everybody could use those? Sure. Just keep in mind that your face-to-face participants may not have a device with them that could access that whiteboard, or if they only have their phone, that might be a little too small of a screen for them to see it comfortably. Planning, though, usually leads to solutions for our particular situations. The final thing about hybrid discussions to consider is virtual buddies. What I mean by virtual buddy is if I don't have a producer or co-host, I may not have as many eyes as needed to look at the chat box, to look at the emojis, or to look at the video boxes to see if people are waving at me. If a lot of my attention is in the physical room, I sure could look at the monitor from time to time, but I'd rather know if something's happening immediately. If I assign virtual participants a virtual buddy with somebody that's in the face-to-face room, that face-to-face individual can speak up for that virtual participant, or they can at least flag me down and say, oh, my virtual buddy has something to say, or they have a question. Maybe we pair virtual buddies one-on-one, one face-to-face with one virtual, sure. But sometimes we only need one face-to-face participant to be our assistant. Yes, they're a participant, but if we trust them to monitor the chat box or the video boxes, they could be my second set of eyes. There's a lot more that goes into discussions in hybrid environments. I'd refer you back to the book that I mentioned in the introduction video of this series, Suddenly Virtual. That has a lot of research and even more tips to dive into.